The photograph arrived in a manila envelope with no return address. I was 73 years old, standing at my kitchen counter in my dressing gown, and I pulled out a picture of a family I had never seen before. A man, a woman, 3 children, a house with a red door, and my father's face, 30 years younger, smiling in a way I had spent my entire life trying to earn. My name is Norma Beecham. I'm 76 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I was the child my father loved less. It took me until I was 73 to understand that there was another family across town who believed exactly the same thing about themselves. My father distributed his inadequacy with fairness. I just didn't know until it was too late to do anything useful with information. Let me tell you about my father first, because none of this makes sense without understanding what kind of man he was. His name was Donald Beecham. He was handsome in the way that certain men are handsome. Not striking, not remarkable, but put together in a way that made you feel he had his life organized, when he probably didn't. He sold insurance for 30 years. He drove a clean car. He wore pressed shirts even on weekends. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of waitresses and held doors open for strangers and made everyone in a room feel briefly that they had his full attention. Briefly. That's the word. My mother's name was Ruth. She married my father in 1951 in a church in Dayton, Ohio, and she spent the next 30 years being quietly, consistently disappointed by him in ways she never fully named. Not because he was cruel. He wasn't cruel. He was simply elsewhere, physically present, emotionally unreachable. The kind of husband who provided for his family and attended their events and fulfilled every visible obligation while keeping the most essential part of himself somewhere. Nobody was allowed to go. I grew up understanding this about him without having words for it. Children understand atmospheres before they understand reasons. The atmosphere in our house was one of managed distance. My mother managed it with practicality and dry humor. My brother Kenneth managed it by becoming interested in things that didn't require our father's approval. Books, mostly, and later woodworking. I managed it by trying. That was my particular strategy. I tried. I brought home good grades and showed him my report cards and waited. I learned to talk about baseball because he liked baseball. I asked him about his work at dinner. I sat beside him when he watched the news and made myself interested in things I wasn't interested in, because proximity felt like a version of closeness even when it wasn't. I was 12, 13, 15 years old, doing the careful arithmetic of a child who believes that the right combination of effort will eventually unlock a door. That is, in fact, bolted from the other side. He wasn't unkind about it. That somehow made it worse. He would ruffle my hair and say I was his good girl, and then go back to whatever occupied him, and I would take that small moment and live on it for a week. He left when I was 17. Not dramatically. There was no argument, no scene, no night of shouting that I could point to later as the before and after. He simply began to be away more, and then more than that. And then one Tuesday evening in March of 1966, his side of the wardrobe was half empty, and my mother was standing in the kitchen making dinner with her back to us, and something in the set of her shoulders told Kenneth and me that we were not to ask questions. He moved into an apartment on the other side of Dayton. He paid child support reliably and saw us on the second and fourth weekend of every month, which he managed with the same organized competence he brought to everything practical. He took us to dinner. He took us to ball games. He asked about school. He was, by every measurable standard, a present and responsible divorced father. But there was still that door, still bolted. I was 17, and then I was 20, and then I was 25. And every time I saw him, I brought the same unspoken question with me, like a coat I couldn't take off. Why is it so hard for you to simply love me the way I need to be loved? And every time he would be pleasant and attentive and slightly distant, and I would drive home afterward feeling like I had reached for something and missed it by exactly the same distance as every time before. I got married in 1972. My husband's name was Patrick, and he was the opposite of my father. In every way that mattered, present, demonstrative, the kind of man who said, "I love you," without being asked, and meant it every time. I want to say that clearly because I think it is important. I had a good marriage. I had a man who saw me. Whatever wound my father left in me, Patrick spent 30 years quietly filling it, and I was grateful for that in a way I could not always express. But my father remained my father. We maintained what I suppose you would call a functional relationship. Holidays, phone calls, the occasional lunch when he drove through our part of the state. He remarried in 1974 a woman named Beverly, who was pleasant and careful around us in the way second wives sometimes are, as if we were furniture that had been left over from a previous arrangement. I was polite to Beverly. I never warmed to her, which I told myself was understandable and probably was. He died in 2009. Pancreatic cancer, the same as it takes so many people, quickly and without adequate warning. I flew to Dayton and sat in a hospital room and held his hand, and he said the things people say at the end, which were kind and genuine, and somehow still not quite the thing I had been waiting for. I drove home afterward and told Patrick that I felt like I was grieving something that had never fully existed, which is perhaps the most honest thing I have ever said about my father. I thought that was the end of it. The envelope arrived 4 years later, 2013, a Tuesday in October, ordinary as they come. Inside the photograph and a single folded piece of paper, the handwriting was a woman's. Neat, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had drafted this letter more than once. Her name was Sandra Oakes. She was 68 years old. Her mother's name had been Patricia. Patricia had met my father at an insurance conference in Columbus in 1963 and had been, for the next 11 years, the woman he went to when he was not with us. Sandra had 3 siblings. The youngest had been born in 1971. My father had been present for all of their birthdays, their graduations, their illnesses. He had paid for things. He had shown up. He had been by every visible measure a present and responsible father. He had simply also been our father at the same time, in the same city, for 11 years. Sandra wrote that she had found my mother's name in their father's papers after he died. It had taken her 4 years to decide whether to write. She said she wasn't writing to cause pain. She said she was writing because she had spent her entire life believing she was the family he was ashamed of, the lesser version, the ones he didn't love quite enough to stay for. And she had recently understood that we had believed exactly the same thing about ourselves, and she thought I should know that. I stood at my kitchen counter and read that letter 3 times. Then I sat down on the floor. Not dramatically. My legs simply decided they were done. What I felt in those first hours was not what I expected. I had always imagined that a revelation of this kind would produce rage. And there was rage eventually. But the first thing, the thing that arrived before anything else, was something closer to recognition. A missing piece sliding into place with a quiet click. All those years of trying, all those report cards and baseball conversations and careful proximity. The door that never opened no matter what combination I tried. And the reason sitting in a manila envelope on my kitchen counter was not that I had failed to find the right key. The reason was that he was using everything he had, all of his presence, all of his attention, whatever thin reservoir of genuine intimacy he was capable of, and dividing it between two families simultaneously, and there simply wasn't enough. He hadn't loved me less. He had loved me at half capacity, because the other half was 40 minutes across town in a house I had never seen, with children who had spent their lives believing they were the ones he was ashamed of. We had been measuring ourselves against each other our entire lives without knowing the other existed. I called Sandra 3 weeks after the letter arrived. I had drafted what I would say many times, and then thrown it away and called without a script, because scripts felt wrong for a conversation like that. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful and a little formal, the voice of someone braced for a response they weren't sure they deserved. I said, "I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that first." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wasn't sure you'd call." We talked for 2 hours that first time. She told me about her childhood, the second and fourth weekends, the ball games, the organized competence. I told her about mine. The overlaps were not identical, but they rhymed in a way that would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so precisely sad. He had pressed shirts in both houses. He had been the kind of man who held doors open for strangers in both lives. He had kept the most essential part of himself. Somewhere nobody was allowed to go in 2 separate households simultaneously for 11 years. She said something I have thought about almost every day since. She said, "I spent 40 years angry at his other family. The real family, I called you, in my head. And now I find out you spent 40 years feeling like the real family was somewhere else." She paused. He did that to both of us. He made us each feel like the consolation prize, without either of us knowing there was a contest. Sandra and I have spoken perhaps a dozen times since that first call. We are not close exactly. The circumstances carry too much weight for easy friendship. But there is something between us that I don't have a clean word for, a recognition. We are 2 women in our 70s who spent our lives being quietly insufficient for the same man. And we have the particular comfort of people who have discovered they are not alone in a room they thought was empty. I think about what I spent my life measuring myself against. The imagined family across town who got the better version of him. The ones he stayed for. The ones who were enough. And they were there across town, measuring themselves against me. Both of us reaching towards something that didn't exist, because he had never been whole enough to offer it to anyone. Maybe you know something about that. Not this story specifically, but the particular exhaustion of measuring yourself against a standard that was never real. Someone you believed had what you were supposed to have. Another family, another life, another version of a person who showed you only the part that was available. And the years you spent trying to become something that would finally be enough, not knowing that enough was never on the table. The thing about being the consolation prize is that you don't know there was a contest. You just know you feel like you're losing. Maybe you've been carrying something like that too. Patrick died in 2018. I have thought about my father differently since then, with something that is not quite forgiveness and not quite understanding, but sits somewhere between the two. He was a man who could not give what he did not have. That is true. It does not excuse 40 years of careful division, but it is true. The photograph is in a drawer in my study. A man with a red-doored house and a smile I spent my whole life trying to earn. I look at it sometimes, and I think about Sandra, 68 years old, pulling out her own version of the same photograph and deciding after 4 years to write a letter to a stranger who turned out not to be a stranger at all. I'm glad she wrote it. I wish it had arrived when there was still someone left to be angry at. The kitchen is very quiet in the mornings now. I make 1 cup of coffee instead of 2. And sometimes I stand at the counter and look out the window and think about 2 little girls in the same city, 40 minutes apart, doing the careful arithmetic of children who believe that the right combination of effort will eventually be enough. Neither of us found the combination. It wasn't ours to find.